Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and today's guest is Ken Rosenthal. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. Today, I'm revisiting my 2016 conversation with photographer Ken Rosenthal. Ken Rosenthal received a BA in still photography from the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts and an MFA in photography from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. His artwork is represented in the United States by Clompching Gallery in New York, Etherton Gallery in Tucson, and Dolby Chadwick Gallery in San Francisco. Since 2002, Ken's work has been featured in more than 150 solo and group exhibitions internationally. His photographs are in many public and private collections internationally, including the J. Paul Getty Museum, the George Eastman House, the Art Institute of Chicago, the National Portrait Gallery in London, and the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, just to name a few. Now, the reason that I wanted to reshare this conversation is not just that I love Ken's work or that this was a particular favorite of mine, though both of those are certainly true, but actually it's that in this conversation we talked about his series Days on the Mountain, which at the time was brand new and hardly seen by anyone yet. Since then, Ken has gone on to have Days on the Mountain published as a beautiful book. It was published in 2019 by Dark Spring Press, and longtime listeners may recognize that as the press run by my guest in episode 64, Andy Burgess. This series is one that I just adore, and getting to talk with Ken early about it was such an honor, so I wanted to revisit the conversation and give you all a heads up about the book. There's a link in the show notes to Ken's online store where you can purchase copies of Days on the Mountain directly from him, either as a standalone book or as a signed and numbered limited edition copy that comes with an 8.5 by 11 print. One more thing before we get started, Ken is going to be one of the featured participants at the Center for Creative Photography's upcoming free virtual fundraising event, Why Photography. The final event date has yet to be announced, but I've included a link in the show notes where you can get more info and check back for updates, so do check that out. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Ken Rosenthal. So how have you been?
It's an interesting question. Been very up and down. It's been a really kind of a strange year and a half or two. Mm-hmm. But things seem to be kind of on the up. Okay. I think just a lot of transitions in my personal life right now. Mm-hmm. So that's been a challenge. It's also, it's informing the work that I'm doing. My work's always been, come from a very personal place. Yeah. So I think like any story, I think photographers tend to be storytellers. I usually think of myself as a storyteller. And if there's no conflict, in a script or a novel, then there's no story. And I think artwork functions the same way. There has to be some sort of an edge or conflict to, as a viewer to fully engage me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. As I recall, the first time I encountered you and your work, it was at the same time. It was at the first Medium Festival.
Yes.
Which I believe was in 2012.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that they're coming up on their, fifth Medium.
Yeah. I remember you gave a presentation of your work to that point, and I was just really taken with what you were presenting. And I think most of it is covered in this sort of retrospective book that I got from you. The 2001 to 2009 photos. I was going over that book again, going back through it and, sort of remembering everything. And what always struck me about those photographs is how sort of psychological they seem, how, they really speak to sort of like a dreaminess or, does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. No, I think they do tap into the dream state somewhat. I think oftentimes, I've heard people talk about how when they look at that work in particular, and I think the work that followed it, there's a bit of that as well, how a lot of the images to them are these really lovely images, but there's an underlying tension to them, which I think is similar to in a dream state. There's occasionally a sequence in there where initially it might be somewhat pleasant or you might be in a beautiful place, but there's a sense that something's off kilter. And that's something that I think I've always been interested in kind of tapping into. And I think I explored quite a bit in the early diffused work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It has such a particular look to it, that diffuse quality that you just mentioned. And I think, if I recall correctly in your presentation, you said that you did that effect is achieved in the enlarger?
Yeah, that's all done in darkroom. So the negatives, I was, when I shoot film, I shoot everything in focus, and all the manipulation is done in the enlarging process. So that by having a sharp negative, it enables me to have really precise control over how much detail I allow to remain in the image, how much I take out of it. Whereas if I were to throw the enlarger out of focus or shoot the image out of focus, I'm limited, by the technical constraints there.
Yeah.
So I always like to work with a well-focused negative.
My experience of you from talking with you before is that when you were giving that presentation at Medium, and then later when I took a workshop that you spoke at, you seem to have a very methodical and sort of analytical approach to a lot of things. But then this work, working in the darkroom where you're doing this technique with the enlarger, it seems like that introduces an element where no two of the prints can ever be exactly the same.
That's correct. Yeah. And that's, to me, is very appealing, because I have never wanted to, try and go in and match prints. To me, that's not interesting. If I'm making an addition in the darkroom, I want for people to be able to have a really unique print. I think there's a part of me that's a frustrated painter. I've never felt like I've had the technical skills to draw the way I would like to, or to paint. And working in the darkroom in the manner that I do, that enables me to, I use brushes in the darkroom. I brush on a lot of chemistry. So that enables me to get that little bit out, that part of me that would like to paint but can't. So I do enjoy the unique qualities of that. And that's, something that I find missing now that I'm working the last, series that I completed and the work that I'm doing now. And I'm shooting digitally and printing digitally. And there isn't really that unique quality to the prints. That's something that I miss. I'm printing my own work now, which I like, but I do miss the kind of hands-on quality of the darkroom, and that ability to let chance, come into play when you're in the darkroom, when especially brushing on different chemicals.
Yeah, and especially with that older work, that element of chance and sort of surprise, it really speaks to the subject matter too, with that dream state where things can be very chaotic.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. And I mean, just even the whole technique, it was kind of a mistake to begin with. I mean, it was an accident how I stumbled across that. So that was a really wonderful chance thing. I mean, that really, that whole technique just came without getting into the details of that of the diffusion, because I never really talk about that, but it was a distraction. I was talking on the telephone when I was making a print, which I typically don't do. And I got distracted and I screwed up, but it was this really lovely mistake. I was very happy with it, but then it took me a while to figure out exactly what I had done. Then I had to go back and try and retrace my steps and figure out where I screwed up, because it was a great screw up.
Yeah, I always find for myself a lot of times that those kind of accidental things that you just kind of stumble upon, those are really often where you make your great leaps forward.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, in every way. I mean, you probably know, like when you go out shooting, if you go out on a road trip shooting, if you miss your exits or you're not paying attention and you go way past where you needed to, veer off onto a different road, it's often those times where you stumble across something that you weren't at all looking for, but you're presented with this gift.
I find sometimes almost that when I'm shooting with an idea in mind, I can almost never actually make any photographs worth looking at. And a lot of times it's only when I'm sort of wandering or not paying attention or not really thinking about photographs that those are the times when the good photographs present themselves.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, very much so. I think sometimes, it's almost like you're trying to force something, and it's just getting to the point where you have to give up control, and then it finds you. Sometimes, going out and seeking something out doesn't work. You sometimes have to let something reveal itself to you more organically.
Yeah. It's almost as though you have to almost let the art be something that flows through you rather than something that you're consciously creating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, you have to be ready when it presents itself. You have to be ready to read it properly. It has to make sense. But I don't think you can plan everything out, so strategically.
It's an interesting thing because, everybody has their own way of working, and a lot of people, working artists and writers I've found that when people talk about their process, many people sort of deprecate the idea of inspiration. And I think there's value to that where, you can't just sort of wait around for inspiration to strike, because inspiration tends to find you when you're working. But at the same time, being able to not overplan things and be able to allow that inspiration to find its way in, I mean, that seems like the real trick.
Yeah, for sure. It just can't be forced, without a doubt.
So you mentioned that your more recent work is shooting digitally, and that workshop that I mentioned with Mary Virginia Swanson was last year, and you were showing some of your early prints, which I think at the time you were not doing your own printing. Is that?
That's correct. Yeah. I just started a little more than a year ago. So it was a couple months after you were out here for the workshop that I started printing myself. Because I found that the one thing that was really keeping me from printing and embracing printing was I didn't have the skill set, to print the way that I wanted to. So I was working with somebody who's an amazing printer, and he made absolutely gorgeous prints for me. So it wasn't an issue that I wasn't pleased with the prints, but I was not pleased with the fact that I wasn't producing them myself, because working in the darkroom for so long, that was such a big part of my creative process, was going in and producing the prints myself. So I realized that I had to acquire that skill set, and I had to take the time to go in and really learn digital printing and get to the place where I felt that I could print as skillfully digitally as I could in the darkroom.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't until late last spring that I really had the time and the funding to really sit down and learn it and experiment, and that I started producing the prints myself. And I went through and in a few months printed the entire body of work, which wound up being, there's probably about 70, maybe 80 images total, of which I probably have maybe a 50 to 60 image set that I consider as in book form. That's the ideal book. But it was a revelation to finally see these images that I'd been working on for over 4 years. I started shooting in 2011 and finished in late 2014. And to that point had really only had a handful of prints made for me.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing. I know a lot of people that they will use other people to do their printing. I've also always found that a little unsatisfying. And as you say, not because the prints come back, looking poor, but just because there's something really satisfying about doing it yourself. There's this quotation, and I can't remember who said it, but that the negative is the score and the print is the symphony.
Yeah, that's Ansel.
I always really liked that idea.
It's a great analogy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it really is perfect. And I do feel like that, I still think of that more when I think of a darkroom than I do digital, but for sure, I have a much greater appreciation for digital printing now that I've really immersed myself in it.
So I had only seen a few of these prints at the workshop, and then you sent me over sort of the full set of them last night. And I was looking through them and just remembering, so these images are all, the series is called The Forest.
Yes.
And then these are all images taken in a forest at night.
Mm-hmm.
They're all extremely dark. These seem like they must just be hell to print. There's so much subtlety in them, and getting that out of an inkjet can, especially where you have a lot of black in them, it's not easy.
No. I mean, and that was, I think, what got me interested. I think if I was doing more straightforward images,
mm-hmm.
I probably wouldn't have been challenged by it. Would have been, taking the attitude that fine, I'll let somebody else print them.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that there was that challenge to me was engaging,
mm-hmm.
to try and really see how far I could push that and how close I could get to replicating what I would see, when I was out in the Selkirk forest at night. So the forest it's in the Colville National Forest, and it's the Selkirk mountain range, which is a range that extends from northeastern Washington state into British Columbia, and I think it might go into parts of northwestern Idaho. It's a very dense range, really heavily blanketed forest, all pine. And it is very far removed. Where my cabin is, it's about 90 some odd miles from the closest city. And the nearest town is about 30 miles away, and that's only 3,000 people. So it's one of those places that has little to no light pollution. I mean, it's one of those spots that is nearly devoid of light pollution as well as noise pollution.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty magical. So the whole experience of being out there, at times it's magical, at times it's a bit frightening, because there's no, you're out there by yourself. There's no cell service. Anything that goes wrong, you're pretty much on your own. And it was one of those fears that I'd had as a kid, was this fear of getting lost in the woods at night. Just how dark it was. So part of it was kind of examining those fears, facing those fears. That's an element kind of underlying it. But I really wanted to try and capture that sensation of how you're out there, and when it's a moonless night or near moonless night, it's nearly completely black. But after a while, because it's so far removed from any cities, even the starlight begins to illuminate it, and your eyes adjust, and you start to make out more detail the longer that you do stay out there. So that was a key thing for me, was trying to preserve that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it took quite a while. There was a lot of work that went into these, working on the files before printing, and then obviously getting in, running some rough prints, and then seeing what adjustments needed to be made.
It really is an amazing body of work.
Well, thank you very much.
When I was a kid, we lived for a year in a cabin in Bixby Canyon in Big Sur. And that's also pretty far from the next town. It's not quite 30 miles, but I think it's about 20. And even after that, when we moved into town, the town that I grew up in was pretty small. And we lived, right across the Carmel River from the Los Padres National Forest. And I have all of these really vivid memories of being in the woods by myself, usually in the daytime. But when we lived in that cabin, if you had to go to the bathroom at night, you had to go outside. And so I have all of those memories of sort of forest noises and being in the dark with no human sounds around. There's something about it, and this, I looking through these photographs, there's the experience of being in a forest by yourself where, even in the daytime, if you are far enough out, where it's simultaneously a little bit lonely and a little bit magical and a little bit vulnerable. And that all three of those seem to be really, really nicely encapsulated in these images.
Well, thank you. Yeah, vulnerability is a perfect word for that, because it's true. I mean, you're out there, you're exposed, you are not necessarily in your natural habitat. You are definitely in the natural habitat of other beings,
mm-hmm.
And that are much better adapted to seeing in the dark, moving in the dark, that know the terrain better.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that. At the same time, having spent so much time at this place, I mean, I've spent nearly every summer of my life up there. So a significant percentage of my life has been spent up there. There was this sort of innate understanding of the land and I think a sense of trust that I wouldn't have if I was going out and photographing in a forest that I wasn't as familiar with.
Yeah. There's definitely a feeling of familiarity and a feeling of respect, I want to say, in the photographs. And the thing that I find myself drawn to is this sort of juxtaposition between, you have these images, like especially the first one, where you just feel this sort of preternatural calmness to it, stillness, that there's such a beauty in that. And you have this feeling like, I may be the only person who's ever seen this. And there's a magic to that.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the same time, you have images like the one of I think it's a moose's leg.
Yes, that is a moose.
Speaks to a certain element of dread when you're out there by yourself. It really sparks a lot of sense memories for me.
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely occasions where I was out shooting and sensed that something wasn't quite right, mm-hmm. and that I needed to leave, and packed up and went in. Just kind of listened to my instinct. But most nights it was a pretty calm environment. The moose was an interesting thing. That was something that somebody had seen earlier, told me about. I went out that evening, found it. It was interesting because it was at a point where I was nearing. I felt like I was nearing completion mm-hmm. of that series. It wound up being the second to last summer that I worked on it. And it felt like an image that I had been looking for, not necessarily a dead moose per se, but I had been looking for something that definitely spoke to death. Because mm-hmm. One of the underlying elements in this series is the life cycle. It's not necessarily about the life cycles, but that is one element to the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So that was something that I needed to find, but I didn't want anything that was quite so in your face as a full-on dead animal. And so spending some time and sitting with it. And it was rather an intense experience because it had probably been there a good day at that point, and it had already become kind of a vessel for wasps. It was a summer where I'd never seen such a presence of wasps as I had this summer.
Mm.
And it kind of one of the things that I remember about that summer was that there was always this electric hum when I went out at night, just about everywhere, that you would hear this humming of these wasps, which was really unusual. And I was a couple times stung by a number of wasps. It was a really odd year, but they had started kind of almost nesting inside the moose.
Mm.
It would then get defensive at times when I would come in closer. But as I was really examining it, I noticed the detail of the legs. I think it was the rear legs of the moose, and how they were crossed over and just kind of lying in this, kind of like tall grass and pressing it down. And there was something just very kind of gentle and peaceful about that to me I realized like, wow, this is exactly what I had been looking for. And I made some other images that were a little more explicit of this, that one of them wound up working its way into a subsequent series.
Right.
But that image to me was something I'd never really thought about. Like, how do you make a really beautiful image about death? Something that I think most of us on some level have a sense of dread or fear of. We probably at some point, many of us get to a sense of acceptance of that great inevitability. But I think in some level, there is a sense of fear of that, whether or not we admit it or want to admit it. But to be able to capture sort of the beauty of that transition to a different state and thinking about the cycle and the continuance of life and how maybe the body is just a vessel.
There's a real tenderness to that image, even in the suggestion of something a little more grotesque, but the image itself has that tenderness to it. There's a thing now you just said where you said you had felt that you were nearing the end of this project, and that is something that I'm always very interested to hear people talk about, artists talk about, because it's one of those things I find varies so much from person to person. But how do you know when you're getting to that point?
Yeah, that's a great question, because for a while I thought like, well, you just know when it's over. And I think when it came to this project and I felt like I had finished, and when I returned to Arizona after a month or two after I returned, there was something that was kind of gnawing at me. And I think it was the various transitions that I was going through at the time. So much of this work was about different transitions in my life. And each year there seemed to be something different that was kind of a central theme. Like there was one year where it was the year after my youngest daughter, Harper, had been born. And so a lot of what was going on in my mind at that time were, kind of the new tensions that existed in a blended family. I had two daughters that were from a previous marriage, and then Harper. And so there's a little bit of sibling rivalry at that point. I mean, she was less than a year old. And so there was a lot of tension that first year when I started working on it. And a lot of the impetus for going out and photographing at night, it was the summer that I was up just with my older girls. And it was just a need to get away and have some time alone, because we all had cabin fever and we're getting on each other's nerves. So I started going out on walks each night alone, and then eventually started taking my camera with me, and then began working on those images later at night. I would always bring my computer up each summer to work on some images, and it wound up evolving into realizing that the series had begun. The following year was a year that I was having difficulty with my eyesight, and wound up having to have eye surgery, and wound up going up to shoot even when I was advised by my doctors to stay in Arizona, go through the surgeries. I was nervous about if something happened and I didn't complete this. So I thought, okay, I'm going to wrap this series up, and then I'll come back for the surgeries. And my eyesight started degrading as I was gone. And so I think that whole fear of the unknown, even something that, logically didn't present a great risk. I think anybody has a fear if something's wrong with your eyes of losing your sight, but for photographers, that's probably amplified.
Oh, yeah.
So that was a huge theme in the second year. Third year, it was some familial tensions, which carried on into the fourth year. But I think that got so amplified after that third year that I realized that there was still some work that needed to be made. And as I began to explore that in 2014, after I got up there, that was confirmed to me. But I'd been convinced in 2013, one night when I made an image. There's an image in there of like a stand of aspen trees. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that one stands out, but just sort of this glowing bark, and the rest of the image is pretty much black. Mm-hmm. And I came across that, and at that time, that seemed to me that was the end note. I was like, okay, it's done. And I remember coming back to the cabin that night and saying, it's done, and I'd put it to bed, but then realizing that it wasn't. And then I think coming back and really starting to make just some really rough printouts before I even started printing. I think I made like some printouts on the color Xerox machine, from digital files, and just put them on index cards and shuffled them around and started really playing with the sequence in physical form, and then realized that, okay, yeah, this to me now, the narrative feels very complete. I don't feel like there's anything missing. And that anything that I might come across, I could probably come up with some more great images each year, but I don't know that I'd be bringing anything new to it.
That's so interesting. It's this thing where you just sort of have a feeling that there's something not quite there yet. I find for myself a lot of times when I've started amassing a body of work that the thing that tells me that I need to start wrapping it up is that I start sort of losing interest in the subject. And that's sort of my signal to say, I think maybe I've taken all the pictures I need to take, and now I need to see what to do with them. Everybody seems to approach it a little bit differently.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that kind of clues me in is when I feel like I'm repeating myself.
Yes.
That's something that stands out to me and is a pretty good sign that at the very least I need to take a break and step away from it for a while. Mm-hmm. So if I lose interest or the images are becoming repetitive, I think there's a good possibility that I'm done.
So you mentioned that there were some other images of that moose that made it into a later body of work, subsequent body of work, and that is this new body of work that I had never seen before, which you very kindly sent me, Days on the Mountain. And
very few people have seen this, so you're like one of maybe 6 people or so.
I feel very honored that you were willing to share this with me. It is a fascinating body of work. You sent it to me in the form of book spreads.
Yes.
So I assume that's your plan for it, is to make it into a book. It seems like in a lot of ways a very different direction for you, not least of which because a bunch of the images are in color.
Yes.
But I found myself really attracted to this work. There's such a strong thematic element to it. And, part of this, I think, maybe has to do with my own personal interests in photography often have to do with personal stories. And that's how I work myself. But so in this series, you are juxtaposing images that really feel taken from your life, little moments here and there. And there are these repeated themes of both, youth and innocence juxtaposed with these images of mortality where, like a dead wasp, a dead moth, the moose. And it really hit on something that I feel is very similar to some themes that I have been working through for several years in my own work. And I'd really love to hear more about the genesis of this project.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's, it's, so the work basically began constructing this work. So it's work that I shot over a long period of time. It's probably 10, 12 year period of time that this work covers. And there are images that were all made up in the Northwest, that were all made up at the cabin, up in the area where the forest was made. And they illustrate a lot of the, kind of family dramas that fed the work that became the forest. So it's a lot of those, kind of little moments and the little family dramas. Those were all captured over the years. And I started assembling this last year, it was around March. And without getting into too much detail, just because it's kind of a private matter and everything, but it's part of my life. It's part of what informs it. I had like this perfect storm in my life that all occurred in about a 2-3 month period, where my marriage fell apart. One of my children became quite ill, and everything was just upside down. And one of my children was hospitalized for quite a while. And that was this period where I didn't know what to do with myself. I mean, I felt so helpless, scared, unsure. Everything felt very unstable at that point. It was kind of like, you have like your 2 or 3 big stressors, and it's like they all hit at once. So I found myself gravitating towards looking at family imagery, trying to kind of make sense of what was happening, what was going on, and just wound up kind of starting to assemble things, and narratives started forming, and again wound up pulling a lot of images that were starting to kind of create a dialogue, and putting them in Lightroom, shuffling them around, printing them out, on a crappy color copier, again, index cards, and wound up with a stack of about 500 images. And then over the next 4 or 5 months, wound up, and this was while I was printing the forest as well. So it was this constant thing. I was not sleeping very well. I mean, I went through this period where I rarely slept. I mean, it was just working obsessively, but wound up shaping it into what I felt was a really tight edit that started to make a lot of sense. And I think really started to examine, not only my own sense of mortality, but thinking about, my family's sense of mortality as well. And things that always had kind of taken for granted, safety, that old expression like, well, you've got your health, so everything's okay. But when that, all of a sudden that's not there, then it's sort of like that leg on a chair that's been broken off or kicked out. So it was, that's where I think a lot of these images of death, come in, or, kind of mixed in with this, I don't know if nostalgic imagery. I don't know if nostalgia is the right word, but, certainly not sentimentality, but, kind of going through and maybe taking inventory on the times, that were both really tender and sweet, as well as problematic. Kind of looking at the overall arc, the overall scope of that period of time.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I think as anybody knows, life is, it's not all up, it's not all down. It's very mixed.
The word that you used, sentimentality, is one that has come up a lot. When I was first starting to get my work reviewed, and, at the point at which I probably shouldn't have been getting reviewed just yet, and the work wasn't quite ready for that, but that was a word that came up a lot as something to avoid. And I think it's an interesting concept to think about what sentimentality means. It's a word that seems to have a lot of very sort of pejorative connotations, especially in the context of art. But I think that there are experiences that we have as humans that are like legitimate and powerful emotions that could be considered sentimental. And I think maybe the thing that people react to negatively and label it sentimentality really has to do more with a sort of saccharine quality, that when something is just sugar and no substance, then that there's no depth to it. But rather, there are many moments in this series which have a sweetness to them, but it's tempered. And this is made explicit by many of the facing images, the pairings that you've chosen. But I think even without the pairings, that, somebody who has had this experience, that there is a bitterness to that mixed in with the sweetness, because these moments of sweetness are so short-lived.
Yes.
There's an image, I'm looking at it right now, of that really says a lot. It has exactly that in it to me, just by itself. And it's an image of a paw print with some, looks like dandelions lying next to it.
Oh, yeah.
And that just so perfectly captures that idea of sweetness but ephemerality to me. That really, to me, that is one of the images that really sort of informs the whole sequence. Yeah, I really like this a lot.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you sharing it with me.
Oh, I'm really happy to. That image that you mentioned, to me, is a really key image. I mean, that image was made, it was either the last night or the second to last night that I photographed for the forest. And I took one of my children out with me, who's the child that wound up becoming ill. And it was right around that time that I realized that there was something that wasn't right, that there was something wrong with my child. And that image, it came at this moment, this revelation, that here was this image that on first glance, you're like, oh, that's really lovely. But then you're like, kind of terrifying, because it's clearly a large, I'm not sure what the print is. I should actually research that. But clearly, there's like two types of animal prints, I think. One that appears to be prey and the other predator. And these, kind of like almost broken flowers. And yeah, it wound up being kind of a prophetic image of just, what was coming, kind of looming trouble.
Yeah, it's a theme that for me sort of, if I have any body of work that anybody knows about, it is this series that I've been working on for several years that has to do with my family. But for me, the way I tend to use photography has to do with really trying to use the photographs as a way of embodying or sort of depicting my emotional state. And that, I use these photographs of my family as a way of sort of exploring that sort of bittersweetness that comes with knowing that there are these joyful moments of parenthood, but that they are going by. And I think that experience is something that a lot of artists in a lot of different disciplines have wrestled with in their work, but it's such a universal experience that it sort of remains evergreen.
No, for sure. I mean, like you said, there's any number of people that come to mind that have really, kind of covered this ground, but that come to it very differently. I mean, it's everybody's family is unique. Everybody has this very unique life experience, that, we do have these kind of universal experiences, this universal lexicon that we can all refer to. And it goes by so fast. And so part of it, I think, was, going through these images, and starting with, like one of my daughters now is in college, but she was probably about 6 or 7 in the earliest images in this series. And seeing her evolve, throughout this, to the point where all of a sudden she's this, a big sister again to this little small person that's, joined the family. It was really fascinating. And then seeing her, nearing adulthood, towards, some of the later images in the series, to me was really very revealing. It was an incredibly cathartic experience putting this together. And it was something I don't know if I'll ever really release these as prints or not, because I really do conceive this as a book. I conceived this as a book, started working on it I never thought about this is going to be a series on the wall. It was all about crafting a story from these images. And so the sequence in this is paramount. And I think, like what you were saying, some of these images by themselves without any other context could be saccharine, could be just a sweet image. It could be a freaking advertisement for something. It could be a Hallmark card, but
I wouldn't necessarily go that far.
Yeah, probably not. That probably is a stretch. But there are some that are much more tender images than others, but they do get tempered, and I think they are prevented from going into that place of sentimentality by the images that precede them and that follow them.
Yeah. I think many of these images would, work perfectly well on the wall, but that really the themes, the emotional content really comes out, as you say, through the sequence of it, through the arc of it. And it is interesting to me, comparing this to the other series of yours that I'm more familiar with, that this one seems to have a more obvious narrative to it. I don't know if that's completely accurate, but maybe I'm just.
Yeah, no. I think you're on the mark there. There are narratives to the other series, but they're more oblique. I think this is not that it's entirely straightforward, but I think it is more straightforward than the other series.
And it's interesting because, like many of your other bodies of work, are sort of like in terms of visual style more. I'm not uniform exactly, but like in this series, you're mixing a lot of different sort of feels to the individual images, and some are more diffused, some are more sharp, some are in color, some are in black and white, that they don't have the same sort of unifying visual aesthetic, but they still, emotionally they hang together in a really powerful way. Thank you.
Yeah, it's I expect that it might throw some people. The few people I've shown it to, and mostly people in the curatorial realm, and to my I don't know if surprise is the right word, but to my I was very pleased to see that what I was trying to get across was read properly. That it seemed to be working, and that I've had good, really good feedback so far on it. But it was definitely, kind of taking a risk, not only showing some color work, which I think is odd enough. If anybody knows my work, I don't really have very much color work, even on my Instagram page. But mixing, mixing color with black and white, mixing formats, square format, landscape, portrait orientation. It became just a non-issue to me because it was about the dialogue of the images, and then it was very liberating to get to the point where I wasn't trying to stay with a consistent format. Like, The Forest is all landscape orientation, the same size, and they're pretty much all black. The other series are, most part, they're square format. So this was really just throwing caution to the wind and hoping that it worked, and I feel like it does. And it also, like, conceiving something specifically as a book was fascinating to me. Just really focusing on the narrative and the story, and not really thinking about the individual images at all. With all the other series that I've done, it's been individual images and then assembling it, to create a narrative, whereas this was really just thinking about the narrative and piecing it together in that fashion with work that existed, and not making work for the project.
Yeah. It's always exciting to, when you find a new way of working and it clicks. That's the best.
Oh, so good. So good. I was exhilarated when I kind of finished that.
So for the second segment, I always ask my guest to bring a topic of your own sort of whatever is on your mind. So what's on your mind?
Boy, we can talk a little bit about change. I'm always like going through changes right now. Music, I'm always interested in talking about music and how music, winds up influencing some of the work that I do. I think a lot of other people I know that photograph derive inspiration on some level from music. But yeah, like right now I have recently sold my house. I'm getting ready to move out of my house and studio, and I'm kind of freaking out about that because I've been living here since '98, and in 2000 I built my darkroom and studio, and I have this really like kind of nice, serene place that's just outside the city limits in this area of open desert. And it's kind of weird to be leaving at the same time. It's exciting to be going somewhere different. And I don't know where I'm going yet. Exactly. I have an idea. I think I found a place. But yeah, it's like kind of not having that sense of stability is at once terrifying and energizing.
Yeah, change is, and it's one of those things that people say is the only constant in your life, that you can always expect things to change. That doesn't necessarily make it any easier when it happens, but it's one of those things. I know for myself, I am certainly a creature of habit and routine, and that I have a certain craving for stability, but that sort of no matter what you do, change always sort of finds its way into your life. And like you say, there is that aspect of the uncertainty being scary, but also exciting if you're open to it. Yeah.
I mean, it definitely took me a while to get to the point of being open to it. And I think it helped finding a place that looked interesting to me. Mm-hmm. Finding this development that was being built and being able to visualize myself in this place. And it was something I never pictured being in a development like this, but it kind of made sense in a lot of ways. And I felt that also that being in a place where I was around people more, where right now I lead such a solitary existence to begin with, as an artist, and spending my days in the studio by myself, but also in an area where I'm kind of removed from people. So the idea of getting more centrally located in the city and being around people, I'm hoping that maybe that maybe sparks some new ideas.
I find for myself, whenever I go through a big period of change, whether it's, moving to a new city, or certainly one of the biggest changes in my life was the birth of each of my children. I also have 3 kids, and it usually takes me a long time to sort of get my feet under myself again. I know, for example, like my kids are all 3 years apart, and each time that one of them was born, it took me about 2 years to sort of feel like I was starting to understand the new rhythms of my life. Uh-huh. And then, of course, we immediately turned around and started having another kid. Fortunately, my youngest is just about to turn 2, but we're fortunately done with that now. But yeah, sort of that experience of finding a new rhythm, once you arrive at it, can feel, you can almost forget that you ever weren't in that new place, but the process of getting there can be protracted and very unsettling.
Oh yeah. No, and it's constantly, I find that it's constantly shifting too, because, it seems like every couple years, each of your kids gets to a totally new stage of life. Mm. And then I think that rhythm gets thrown at the wall again. Mm-hmm. It gets disrupted. And then I think with several kids like you're going to have this thing where you're going to have 3 kids, and they're all at very different stages, mm-hmm. A couple different schools, and the rhythm really gets thrown off then. And it becomes infinitely more challenging, I think, as a creative person, being able to carve out that time and find that balance between family life and making your own work.
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
I'm suddenly in this place now where I have more time, with two of my children are older and one's moved out of the house, and neither of the two are, with me very often. It's kind of more limited time that they're here. So I'm suddenly in a place where I have more time to devote to my work, which on one hand is really lovely. At the same time, I start to get a little, go back to the sentimental word, start feeling a little sentimental about, my God, this went so fast.
Mm-hmm.
That like Harper, who's 5 now, it's just like, my God, she's like becoming a big girl all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And that's where did the baby go? and then you see babies out and you're starting to miss it. And now I'm gonna shift gears before I become like this completely, like overly sentimental person. But no, I mean, it's really, being a parent has been really one of the greatest gifts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've certainly found that for myself. And it is funny how, I think it's pretty common, especially for creative people who have younger kids, can find themselves, that I think for almost every type of, maybe performing artists are a little different, but certainly for visual artists and writers, that a lot of the work is very solitary and sort of needs a certain amount of space to breathe. And then you get used to working that way. And then all of a sudden you have a family and you find yourself working sort of catch as catch can, and maybe longing for the old days when you could spend maybe an entire day just working on something. But then when you do find yourself with a little more space to breathe, you maybe hardly even know what to do with yourself.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I have had, over the past year and a half or so, just a lot of time to work, which, it mixed blessing,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's great, but it also has its drawbacks.
Yeah.
But, I've got some new work that I've started on recently that I'm excited about, curious to see where it goes, not, still in very, very, very early stage. But it's, I think the genesis is there and has built up.
Yeah.
So it's kind of curious to see where that goes over maybe the next year or two.
Mm-hmm. And it is interesting, that is sort of one of the things about being an artist, that these changes in your personal life so often lead to changes in your work. And, certainly we spoke about how the Days on the Mountain book represents a pretty big departure from what you've done before. And I can only imagine that, as you said, had a lot to do with the changes that were going on in your life. As you continue, as we all continue to move through life and have new experiences, those all sort of filter into the work in one way or another. It's always one of the things that I find so fascinating about being able to look through an artist's archive and see the progression of their work over time, and how their life and how the changes in their life always end up informing the work in new ways.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. When I started thinking about that recently, I was back in Toronto about a month ago or so. And I had the great fortune of going to an exhibition that was up there. They had a photo festival going on, and there was an exhibition called The Outsiders. That was tremendous. And it had probably 8 to 10 artists' work, from focusing on artists from the 50s through the 70s that were kind of considered outsiders or were working, with those that were viewed as outsiders, but focusing on photo and film. So there was one of the big shows there was Diane Arbus.
Mm-hmm.
And it was amazing. I mean, it was a huge room in the museum of Arbus's work that must have been 40 to 50 prints. So other than the Revelation show that I saw some years back at LA County Museum, this was far and away the largest show of hers that I'd seen. Other than that, but I started looking at this and thinking back on some of the earlier work that I had made, and was like, oh my God, I was really so clearly influenced by her work early on that it was kind of embarrassing thinking about that early work that it seemed so obvious to me, at least, and I'm sure to others, I don't really show that work very often, but that's such an essential part, I think, of beginning to grow as an artist, is I think you do have to go through that stage where you are, the point where maybe you go past influence, right? And it's becoming a little derivative or what have you, to the point then maybe where it gets to, you look at it and you're like, okay, there's an influence there, and then you ultimately, ideally, find your own voice. And yes, there's influence, but that's hopefully not the first thing that comes to mind. Is when that deadly question when somebody says, "Oh, do you like such and so and so's work?" And you're like, "Oh, okay."
Yeah. I mean, as an educational tool, working through your influences is, I think you're right. I think that's a necessary step. But it's so interesting because that the idea of finding your voice is something that every artist I've ever heard talks about the importance of finding your own voice. But the process by which you do that, by which you acquire a style or a point of view or any of those things with your work, is so mysterious. That's one of those things that I know I certainly thought a lot about when I was first starting. And I would hear, I'd listen to other people's podcasts and hear, people write in with questions. And everybody seems to have this question, like, how do you develop your own voice? And ultimately it seems like, I don't know if that's a question that can really be answered,
Yeah, I don't know that it is, I think, part of it is just, a sense of honesty at a point, and just, getting to a place where you are working honestly without regard to what people are going to think of this work, what box will this fit in, how is this going to be placed? Just doing the work that comes from an honest place, being true to yourself and letting it happen, and it starts to feel right at a point. But yeah, I don't think you can write an instruction manual on how to find your own voice. I think it's you just have to get out and have life experiences and be open to new things, take chances, fail, not be afraid to fail, not be angry at failing, recognizing that failure is a big part of it. I don't know that you can really succeed if you don't have some failures.
Yeah.
I think if you're not failing, you're not trying.
Yeah, definitely failure indicates that you've been trying to reach for something. And if you are never trying to extend your reach, then, you can only be safe, and you can never move past your influences at that point. It is interesting because I think especially when we're young, we tend to have this feeling like everyone else that we admire is doing such amazing things, and how could we ever measure up to that? But then at some point you have this realization that no one else has ever had your experiences in life, and so no one else could ever actually see things exactly the same way that you do. And coming to that realization is, I think, it's a necessary step for any artist, but it can be really difficult to get to.
Yeah, and I think also just, staying open to what lies ahead and what's in front of you. So I know I used to at times get concerned about trying to make work that would live up to earlier work. And I kept thinking like, oh God, the first series that I put out, I'm never going to make anything that's as successful as that,
Mm-hmm.
that's as strong as that. And it wasn't until I could finally let go of that whole notion and not think about that I made work that I felt was stronger than that.
Mm-hmm.
And just then, being open to that idea and not trying to make work with the idea that it would reach a certain type of success or this was the end goal for it. Just making the work that felt right and felt true.
Yeah, even that. I mean, it's even when you've been doing it for a while, it can be hard to maintain that sort of equanimity towards your own work. I know. I mean, even I remember. I think this was last year. I read Sally Mann's autobiography, her Hold Still book.
Oh, I need to read that. I haven't read it yet.
I mean, it's fantastic. I mean, she's an amazing writer. But there is one of the things that I found so fascinating in it is to see this person who is, rightfully held up as sort of a legendary photographer, expressing anxieties and fears about her work that are exactly the same as, a first-year student feels, that there was one point where she was talking about, a period between two bodies of work and having this anxiety that she always gets where what if she's made all of her good photographs and that there are people, in her life who are friends or family who will just sort of blithely say, oh, whatever, you always come up with something, you will again. But that can be hard to trust that when you're in the middle of it. I think, there was so much value for me in reading or talking to other artists and knowing that we all still deal with those same anxieties, throughout our careers.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, there's as much as, you tell yourself, like, I really don't care what anybody thinks. I'm making this for myself. Yeah, ultimately, I'm making work for myself. But, yeah, I do care what people think. I do want the work, not necessarily to be liked or embraced, although that's wonderful, but to be understood, to be viewed. Mm-hmm. I mean, I do want the work to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be lying if I said I didn't. Ultimately, I think we make work for ourselves, but if we put it out there, there's a reason for that. We do want it to be seen.
Yeah. Yeah. I always sort of liken art in that way to being a conversation where that if you're just talking to yourself, there can be value in that, but that it doesn't have the same function or meaning as when you say something and someone hears it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, I think that is maybe not a terrible place to wrap up.
Okay.
I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Oh, thanks for asking me. I really have enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, and I have been a big fan of yours for quite some time, so this was a real treat for me.
Oh, well, thank you. I really enjoyed meeting you initially out in San Diego and then getting to catch up again last year, and look forward to continuing the conversation down the road, one place or another.
Yeah.
Probably Arizona or California.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, you can purchase a copy of Days on the Mountain directly from Ken via his online store. There's a link in the show notes for that. And do check out the link to CCP's upcoming Why Photography event as well. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. Whether you're a longtime listener or you've just found the show for the first time, thank you so much for spending the time with me. If you enjoyed today's conversation, I hope you'll share it with someone who might like it. You can follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at ChannelOpenPod. And you can find all of the rest of the show's social media information, email newsletter, show notes, and transcripts at keepthechanneleopen.com. Next time, I'll be talking with photographer Farah Karapetian. That will be coming on April 7th, so stay tuned for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.